Good evening, and welcome to this unusual but sadly necessary Jewish Renaissance event. We're responding to President Zelensky's request for support for Ukraine from the global Jewish community. And thank you to the Jewish Book Council for partnering with us and making this a transatlantic event. So to those of you in North America, let me say good afternoon. It's also a fundraiser for World Jewish Relief's Ukraine Crisis Appeal. Perhaps this is the most important aspect of what we're doing this afternoon. WJR is working with 29 partner organizations in Ukraine and working in the neighboring countries, helping with food, money, support, helping the refugees, helping the people still there in Ukraine. So I can only ask you from the bottom of my heart to support World Jewish Relief and make a donation at the end of this event to their Ukraine Crisis Appeal. We'll show you the link for you to do that. And thank you to everyone who's already donated. Joshua Meir has referred to Ukraine as one of the richest stews of Jewish life. The country has a strong religious and political tradition. I mean, it's no coincidence that President Zelensky is Jewish. After all, this is the country that's given us the Baal Shem Tov, Golda Meir, Leon Trotsky. I didn't mention the culture. That's because we've now got a stellar cast of speakers who are going to tell us about and discuss a nation in flux, Ukraine's Jewish culture, past and present. And so I'm now going to hand over to Aviva Deutsch, Executive Director of Renaissance Publishing, and Rebecca Taylor, Editor of Jewish Renaissance, who will introduce our guests and take the evening forward. But before I do so, I must acknowledge and thank their amazing work over the last week or two to put this event together. Thank you, Aviva. Thank you, Rebecca. And over to you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Aviva Deutsch, and like I'm sure many of you in the audience, my family originally comes from that part of Eastern Europe known as the Pale of Settlement, spread across Lithuania, Poland, Moldova, Russia, and of course, Ukraine. But it's not just about personal or familial relationships for us, but also communal and cultural ones. When Hebrew was revived as a modern language just over a century ago by scholars such as Eliezer ben Yehuda, who was born in Belarus, and Chaim Nachman Bialik, who studied in Volozhin and lived in Odessa, they borrowed the word for history, historia, from the Greek, as it didn't exist in biblical Hebrew. In Jewish tradition, the word used instead is zachor, meaning memory, because for Jews, the past isn't academic, it isn't dispassionate. I'm sure I'm not the only one of us watching the news who hears Kishinev and remembers the pogrom there in 1903, as described in Bialik's long political poem, The City of Slaughter, or sees Odessa and thinks of Jewish gangsters and Isaac Babel's Odessa stories. Chernowitz on the Romanian border sings to us through the poems of Paul Celan, and the Carpathian Mountains bring to mind the early years of Elie Wiesel. And to these we can add contemporary Jewish voices, such as Ilya Kaminsky, Maria Stepanova, and the many wonderful writers and historians who are with us today.
Hello, I'm Rebecca Taylor, the editor of Jewish Renaissance. And this understanding of Jewish memory that Aviva's been talking about was really brought home to me when I visited the country in 2015 for a special issue of JR focusing on Ukraine's Jewish culture and history. And we're going to see some of the pages from that issue just now. So in the most immediate way, that sense of memory was there with the Jewish refugees I met who were fleeing the bombs dropping on their homes in the Donbass region after the recent Russian invasion. And you can see some of those refugees in our next slide. Two of these refugees, Valentina and her daughter Yulia, were sharing a small room in the town of Zaporizhia, where they were being offered shelter in a project run by World Jewish Relief. I wrote at the time, in her shelter, Valentina and her daughter tried to continue some semblance of normal life, recently attending a show of Fiddler on the Roof, free to internally displaced persons. I cried throughout, said Valentina. You can't help thinking that Shalom Aleichem's famous story, set over 100 years ago and ending with Tevye and his neighbors wandering into the horizon after being forced from their Ukrainian village, touches a particular nerve for the Jews who find themselves on the move again today. In other pieces in that issue, Boris Dralyuk, who I'm happy to say is with us as a panelist today, he looked at the wonderful cosmopolitan heritage of Odessa, that famous great port city. The translator, Robert Chandler, whom I believe is in the audience, also wrote about the Ukrainian Jewish writer Vasily Grossman. Timothy Snyder, one of the foremost historians on Eastern Europe, explored the pluralist history of Dnipropetrovsk with its large Jewish population, writing that Russian soldiers just across the Dnieper River in the east would, if they approached the city, see that its most magnificent building dominating the skyline was in the shape of a menorah. A huge synagogue and a museum complex lay below it. Would they then have any doubts about their mission to save Ukraine from fascism, as Russian propaganda proclaims? Timothy Snyder asked back then. And in another feature, I met an amazing young woman, Chris Kulakovska, who had put a call out on Facebook for young Ukrainians of mixed ethnic backgrounds to get in touch for a magazine photography project that she was working on. Dozens of people across the country got in touch, many with Jewish backgrounds. And you can see some of her beautiful photos here, where the people are talking about their backgrounds with identities, a mix of identities, including Jewish, German, Ossetian, Romanian, Austrian, Polish, Armenian, Indian, Finnish, Russian, and Georgian Gypsy. Chris told me, we need to understand others, however different they may be. So tonight, we hope to give you a flavor of this fascinating and complex culture, to show you a Ukraine that is not simply defined by blasted buildings and lines of refugees that we've been seeing so terribly recently, but at the same time convey a deeper understanding of the country and people who are caught up in this terrible conflict.
So many of us know that old Jewish joke. I've lived in 5 different countries during my lifetime, but never left home. Well, the name Ukraine is thought to originate from the Slavic word for frontier region or borderland. The country's unique position, wedged between Europe and Russia, means it's continually been a place where nationalities and identities have interwoven as borders has shifted. As we say in our title, it's been a nation in flux, on the edge, but also cutting edge. So we're going to start the event this evening with an overview of Ukraine's edgy history, and then each of the following speakers will concentrate on a different location, from Kiev to Odessa to the Crimean Peninsula. Alex Brookes will bring us up to date on the work World Jewish Relief is doing in the area in response to the current crisis. And then we'll finish with a song from Babyn Yar.
So Amelia Glaser's 2016 book, Jews and Ukrainians in Russia's Literary Borderlands, tells the story of Ukraine's coexisting Russian, Ukrainian and Yiddish communities through language and literature. She is Associate Professor of Literature and holds an endowed chair in Judaic Studies at the University of California, San Diego. Over the last few weeks, she's been posting online her English translations of contemporary Ukrainian poets whom she's worked with, offering a cultural commentary alongside the terrible news that's unfolding in front of us. And we're delighted to have Amelia as our first guest.
Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this panel. There's nothing more important than Ukraine right now, certainly to me and to many in the world. And there's a lot to say about the historical and current multi-ethnicity of Ukraine. The area that I have focused on for my entire academic life has been Jewish-Ukrainian relations. And so I'll talk a little bit about this historically. I think the fact that Zelensky, who is a Ukrainian of Jewish descent, was elected president was confusing to a lot of people outside of Ukraine, who tended to associate the country with, let's say the pogroms of the Civil War or the 1648 Cossack uprisings that were led by Bogdan Khmelnytsky. There have indeed been many historical moments of conflict between Jews and Ukrainians. And this is something that the Kremlin rhetoric has worked hard to capitalize on. They've constantly accused Ukrainians of staging a pogrom. This goes back to the 2013-2014 Maidan, or Revolution of Dignity, Revoluция Hidnosti. Ukrainians have been accused of being neo-Nazis. Dmitry Medvedev, the former president, in an article that was published this past October, even suggested that Zelensky, whom he called in the article a person of a certain background, is perhaps afraid of the Ukrainian nationalists that he's leading. So I'm going to actually talk about some of the moments of conflict that have been alluded to in these various discussions. And the big point that I want to make, and the point that I'm going to end on, is the fact that Ukraine is changing. It's a place that has been in a kind of process of becoming as a country for a long time, but especially since its independence in 1991. And that this idea of an ethno-national identity, which so long defined Ukrainians when they were struggling for self-determination, first under the Tsar and then during the Soviet Union, has emerged as it's kind of shifted into a civic identity that has meant that Ukrainians of all different backgrounds have defined themselves by their citizenship and not by their nationhood. I find this process to be completely remarkable. So my own first association, just to begin and to be, fully honest, with Ukraine also involved conflict. I associated Ukraine with pogroms, with various forms of violence. I took a trip to Ukraine in 1999 when I was about to start a master's degree in Yiddish at Oxford. And I went with a friend, and we sort of jokingly found ourselves at like 6 a.m. in the morning in the city of Khmelnytsky. And we ended up saying the morning prayers in front of the statue of Khmelnytsky in a kind of ironic gesture. And on that same trip, we were just sort of exploring. We were talking to people in Yiddish. We were recording them, sort of trying to become the researchers that we wanted to be. And we arrived in the town of Medjugorje, which was the burial site of the Baal Shem Tov. And when we stopped to ask a couple of elderly Ukrainian men if they knew of any Yiddish speakers in the area, I was reproached by one of them who said, I was in a camp too. I suffered too. Don't you want to hear my story? And the truth was, I did want to hear his story. But even more than that, I wanted to understand this strange place, this place where the narrative that I had at the time as a 24-year-old American didn't exactly match the complexity of this place of conflicting historical narratives, of conflicting cultural pain. So even then, and this was a long time ago, Ukraine was a diverse country. It was a country that was trying to make sense of this diversity. And something that I have seen take place in the years that have followed has been this movement towards what people have referred to as Ukraine's burgeoning civic identity. This has been especially true since the Maidan of 2013-2014. More residents of Ukraine are calling themselves Ukrainians. More Russian speakers are calling themselves Ukrainians. And in fact, the category of identity that means Ukrainian has shifted away from ethnicity and towards citizenship. So I've long viewed Ukraine in my own work as a contact zone. It's a place where Ukrainians and Jews, among others, have developed cultures in the context of their own diverse environment. This was especially true in the 19th century when Jews were confined to living in the Pale of Settlement within the Tsarist Empire. And this included parts of what are now the Baltic states, but a very large part of the Pale of Settlement was Ukraine. And coexistence at this time didn't necessarily always involve empathy. The Jews that show up in Ukrainian texts by Kotlяревsky, Gogol, Kvitska, and others, tend to be one-dimensional. And the Ukrainians that show up in Oxenfeld, Mendele, Sholem Aleichem, and other Jewish writers were also somewhat one-dimensional. And yet, I came to see the stories of what I've called the 19th century Ukrainian commercial landscape. This is a sort of a landscape of multi-ethnic markets and fairs as close-knit models for world literature, a place where characters with very different, sometimes antagonistic backgrounds looked sidelong at one another and borrowed from one another. So I'm not going to delve deeply into examples here. I don't have the time or space for that, but I'll offer just a couple of brief names. Modern Yiddish literature owes a lot to Nikolai Gogol, who was the Russian writer born in Ukraine. Gogol wove Ukrainian words, phrases, practices into his stories, especially his very early ones. They included a Ukrainian glossary. Sholem Aleichem, the great Yiddish writer who wrote the Tevye stories, among other things, kept a copy of Nikolai Gogol's Laughter Through Tears passage from the novel Dead Souls on his desk, and he wove ideas from Gogol into so many of his short stories. And this landscape that Gogol describes was kind of a challenge to the center. It was a challenge to the high culture of St. Petersburg, where the Tsar was. In a way, it was also a threat to that. It was the outside, it was the outskirts, it was porous. Things could get in. There were a lot of different kinds of people moving around in these borderlands of the empire. Modern Yiddish literature emerged in large part as a kind of imitation of Russian and Ukrainian naturalist portrayals of life in this region. It simultaneously offered a corrective to negative Jewish characters in Slavic literatures, and often also borrowed types and tropes. So Israel Oxenfeld wrote what was considered to be the first Yiddish language novel, The Headband, or Das Sterntechel, in the 1840s. It wasn't published until the 1860s. But one of the heroes in this novel, Oksman, fools a town's Hasidic followers into thinking he was a great Rebbe only to reveal their gullibility. And this is an act that very much resembles the Inspector General and Hlestyakov's unmasking of the entire town. Early Yiddish writers used Ukrainian-speaking characters and even bits and pieces of Ukrainian. We find that, for example, in Mendele's 1878, The Tales of Benjamin III, among other places. You have this character, this hapless Jewish character in this story that originally was written in Hebrew and then was rewritten in Yiddish, who doesn't have any real skills for navigating the territory, kind of wanders in circle, seeking the land of Israel. And he sometimes has to speak Ukrainian. He finds that Ukrainian figures help him out, even though he doesn't expect them to. So this is already a theme in the 19th century. These are, of course, works that were written for Jews, but Ukrainian literature and Russian literature helped to form them. In the 1880s, the Khmelnytsky uprisings were in the air again. A monument to Khmelnytsky was unveiled in 1888 in the center of Kiev. It's still there, or was there. The pogroms of the 1880s were the first major incidents of violence against Jews in Ukraine since the times of Khmelnytsky, and those were still vivid in Jews' minds, and much was written about pogroms at this point. And then we come to 20th century Yiddish and Hebrew literature. Yiddish and Hebrew poetry arose as a kind of modern means of making sense of Jewish catastrophe. And that landscape of Ukraine, again, became an important informing point for that. And then we get to World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution, which ushered in this period of experimentation, but also new pogroms, that Jews were often casualties when there was violence in the region of Ukraine. Well, even during the period of the Soviet Union, a period when individual groups were often, cast as being overly nationalistic if they tried to commemorate their tragedies, and this happened to both Jews and Ukrainians in the commemorations of the Holodomor, the Great Hunger, or of Babyn Yar, the Nazi massacre of tens of thousands of Jews outside of Kiev. So even during the Soviet period, when individual groups were often demonized and polarized by being told that they're nationalists or Zionists, you do have important moments of rapprochement between Jews and Ukrainians. You often will find Ukrainians, for example, Ivan Zuba, writing about Jewish loss in World War II as something that Ukrainians need to write about, need to struggle for. Ukrainians need to struggle on behalf of Jews. But ethnic difference still remained a paradigm in the region of Ukraine, even at the end of the Soviet period. In 1991, when Ukraine finally gained its independence, there was still an idea that this was a sort of ethno-national identity with Jews living there and with some Russians living there and so forth. So as I've already mentioned, I've observed this changing. And this is a point I think often amidst the conflict, it's tempting to say, no, Ukrainians have always been the most democratic society ever. Ukrainians have gone through a very, very careful process of considering history and of thinking about a way of integrating its many different backgrounds into Ukrainian identity. And I think it's important to make this point. Even in 2004, when President Yushchenko, after the Orange Revolution, was elected to lead Ukraine, there was still something of a rhetoric of ethno-nationalism in Ukraine. Yushchenko installed, named the former far-right nationalist Stepan Bandera a hero of Ukraine. And this is I believe, a mistake that the Kremlin has seized upon as a way of accusing Ukrainians of being dangerously Nazi or dangerously nationalist. While, of course, many citizens of Ukraine did embrace Bandera as one of the important figures that fought against Soviet rule, many others rejected this idea, and this could easily have figured into Yushchenko's defeat by Yanukovych in 2010. Even Petro Poroshenko, who really did a valiant job leading Ukraine during the first 5 years of the Donbass war, ran for re-election on a campaign of army, language, faith. And I think that the fact that a Russian-speaking secular Jew from the industrial East defeated the incumbent Poroshenko in 2019 suggests that a vast majority of Ukrainians had moved towards a different unifying narrative. Zelensky had spoken out against Putin's invasion of Donbass already when he was before he ran for election, and he'd also spoken out in defense of Russian language culture, and this was part of what Ukrainians were voting for. So this civic energy of the Maidan protests, I think, has led to new efforts, both political and artistic, to acknowledge Ukraine's diversity. Non-Jewish Ukrainians have embraced Jewish history as part of Ukrainian history. The Lviv-based poet Mariana Kianovska published a really haunting book about the massacre in Babyn Yar in 2017, and this has now come out in English translation. In 2021, just several months ago, the filmmaker Sergei Loznitsa released a film about Babyn Yar that was actually quite controversial because it's very critical of Ukrainian nationalism. So there's a conversation about reassessing the history of Ukrainian Jewish relations that I think needs to be noticed. But you also have collaborations between Tatar artists and Ukrainian artists. Mustafa Naim, who was one of the first people to initiate the Maidan movement in 2013, is part of the government now. It's a highly diverse place. So these discussions of multi-ethnicity are not easy. They're definitely not perfect. But what we're seeing is a collective effort to acknowledge Ukraine's multiple histories. And this, I believe, has helped to define a current pluralist vision. So I'll conclude by saying that Russia's leadership has at various intervals over history referred to the brotherhood of Kiev and Rus. This is this ancient and medieval precursor to Russia that viewed the Slavic peoples of the region to be united by blood, language, and Eastern Orthodoxy, which had replaced paganism. And Putin, in fact, in this weird manifesto that he published in July of this past year, even referred to the blood ties between, the religious ties and the ancient ties between Russians and Ukrainians as one of the reasons that Russia and Ukraine should be united today. So while it's true that ethnicity has divided Ukrainians from other ethnic groups in the past, there's a great irony in the current claim that Ukrainians might somehow be ethno-nationalists or even Nazis, when it's in fact Kremlin rhetoric that has insisted on an ethnically defined unity. So I wanted to share an image before I conclude. I'm going to just share a single image, and okay. Oh, there we go. Hopefully you can all see that, and I'll move this. Okay, great. So I wanted to close by sharing this image from an episode from Sluga Naroda. This is the sitcom that Zelensky created and starred in before he became president of Ukraine. And for those of you who don't already know about Sluga Naroda or Servant of the People, this is a show about a history teacher who runs for president by mistake. One of his students kind of sets him up as a prank. He gets elected president very much accidentally, and then he has to kind of navigate this role. And it's a Russian language TV show. This is the TV show that gave its name to Zelensky's political party. But in several of the episodes, Holoborodska, which is the name of the character Zelensky plays, hallucinates these historical figures from the past. And in one of the episodes, he hallucinates Ivan the Terrible, Ivan Grozny. And he, he's in the middle of this performance in front of a bunch of people, and Ivan the Terrible says, you are the Tsar. You are the law, you are the Tsar. And Holoborodka protests and says, no, I'm not a Tsar. Ivan the Terrible says, then who are you? Whose are you? Holoborodka, I once had a jester by that name, a real wit. I had his tongue cut out. And then, it goes on. They have this sort of continued conversation. I believe that what Ivan is asking really when he says, whose are you, is what is your bloodline? Who could you possibly be? So there's a bit of a reference to Zelensky's own undecipherable bloodline. He doesn't fit into this exactly this Slavic brotherhood. Holoborodka clarifies for Ivan the Terrible that he is the democratically elected president of Ukraine, and Ivan responds, so how are you doing, my brothers? Are you still under the rule of the Poles and the Lithuanians? Be patient, we will soon free you. And Holoborodka then responds that the Ukrainians don't need freeing, we will go to Europe. What? But we are Slavs, we are one blood, Ivan exclaims. Holoborodko then rejects the relevance of blood, saying, why don't you go your way and we'll go ours? We'll head in different directions and we'll talk again in 300 years. Well, this is a show that ended in 2019 when Zelensky was elected president, but ironically, he's dealing with a very similar rhetoric today in dealing with Putin. And I've shared with you this screen capture from the episode where eventually Holoborodko falls away in a faint. Ivan is holding on to him as if he needs to hold on to his son, in an imitation of the famous Repin painting of Ivan the Terrible, who has just murdered his son. I'm going to stop there, but I'm happy to take up more of this in the question and answer section. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Amelia. That was wonderful. I felt like I was Gogol flying over not just the city, but the country and hundreds of years of history. Just to clarify for everyone, we are trying to keep the seminar tight tonight. We've got a lot of speakers, so we're not going to officially do a question and answer session. But what we will say to you is we've allowed our chat to be fully interactive. So if any of you do have questions, please do put them in the chat or in the Q&A box, which is also available on the webinar. And we will make sure to keep an eye on those and hopefully answer the questions as we go along. So we're going to now go into different directions, go in those different directions Amelia was talking about. Our next speaker to take us there is Natan Meir. I'm really delighted to have Natan here. He's an old friend from his time in Oxford and Southampton, but nowadays he's a consultant to the Moscow Jewish Museum, among others. And he's chair of Jewish studies at Portland State University. So Natan is a scholar of the cultural, social and religious history of East European Jewry. He speaks, I think, about 5 languages and probably reads another 2 to 3. His most recent publication, Stepchildren of the Shtetl, explores the life of liminal Jews in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and includes amazing stories of the kinds of rituals they created to end a pandemic, such as the cholera wedding. But tonight, however, he's going to focus on his previous book, for which he spent many years researching in Ukraine, and he's going to take us to Kiev, which in his book's title he describes as a Jewish metropolis. Natan, over to you.
Thank you, Aviva. Thanks for inviting me to be here tonight and to contribute to this really important event. I'm really honored to be with you and to be able to talk a little bit about Kiev, or Kyiv in the Ukrainian, as many of us know it today. I'm going to share my screen because that's the way that I'm used to teaching on Zoom. And it always takes a few seconds to share a screen, never as quick as you want it to be. Let's see here. So as Aviva mentioned, I did write a book on Kiev. You can see the title here. It was called Kiev, Jewish Metropolis. I might choose a different title today. I might choose to call it Kyiv, K-Y-I-V, but I called it Kiev because it's about the period under Russian rule. It's about the Jewish community in the city from the late 19th century up until World War I, when it was part of the Russian Empire, and it was officially known as Kiev, and so I decided to call it that. You can see, actually, for some reason, the arrow is not lining up correctly, but the arrow should be pointing slightly south of where it is right now to Kiev, which was part of the Kiev province, as you can see on the map. And actually, Kiev itself was the capital of what was known then as the southwestern region of the Russian Empire. Ukraine itself had no political identity at the time within Russia. Generally, Russians called the Ukrainian region or the Ukrainian lands Malorossia, or Little Russia. And you can see here these three provinces, three gubernia, Volhynia, Podolia, and Kiev, of which Kiev was the capital. These were part of the Pale of Settlement, which Aviva mentioned earlier tonight, and they were very, very densely settled by Jews. Now, Jews started settling in Kiev in small numbers in the late 18th century, but it was only in the 1860s that a sizable Jewish community began to develop, because Kiev held a strange legal position in the Pale of Settlement. It was officially excluded from the Pale of Settlement, mostly because it was considered to have exceptional Christian character because of its important monastery and complex of churches. And for other complicated reasons, Jews were officially excluded from Kiev. So you have to fit into special, let's say, socioeconomic categories in order to live in Kiev. But despite that, many Jews moved to Kiev, even if they did so illegally. So we know that by the late 1870s, early 1880s, Jews already make up over 10% of the population, and those are the official numbers. So as I said, there were probably many more Jews who lived in Kiev under the radar without official papers. And there were also suburbs outside of the official city limits where Jews lived in large numbers, and they would commute into the city during the day. Kiev was an important administrative center for the Russian Empire. It was also very important from a commercial and industrial point of view. And Jews played an important role in that economic development. The city was really a multi-ethnic city. So as best as we can gauge, and this is difficult because the censuses that we have of Kiev from that time usually ask about language, but it's sometimes difficult to correlate language, the language that people give as their everyday language, with ethnicity. But the estimates are that a little over half of the population was ethnically Russian, or at least gave Russian as their native language, or as their language of everyday use. About a quarter of the population was Ukrainian. And as I said, somewhere around 13% of the population was Jewish. Kiev had several neighborhoods that were more heavily Jewish than others, where Jews tended to settle. One of these was called Podol, or in Ukrainian Podil, and that's the one that you see in the lower left image, a view from the south, looking north along the Dnieper or the Dnipro River to the low-lying Podol area. That and a neighborhood just north of it were heavily, and by heavily I'm talking about somewhere between 10 and 20% Jewish. Those that tended to be a poorer neighborhood. These were working class Jews, usually, who lived in those neighborhoods. And there was also a market in the city called the Yevreysky Bazaar, or the Jewish Bazaar, which was slightly to the west of the central area. The main street of the city, as it still is today, it was called Kreshatik in Russian, Kreshatik in Ukrainian. You can see it here in the upper right. Looks very different today because it was rebuilt after World War II with neoclassical Stalinist architecture, but it was and remains the kind of main avenue of the city. And at that time, there were Jewish enterprises that you could find on the Kreshatik, along, of course, with enterprises that were owned by Russians and to some extent Ukrainians as well. Now, Jews played a very important role in the development of the city. There was a very small coterie of extremely wealthy Jews who mostly made their money from the sugar industry. The hinterland of Kiev was rich, it was fertile land for sugar beets, and the sugar processing took place mostly in Kiev itself. One of the wealthiest men who engaged in the sugar industry was Lazar Brodsky, who you can see here. He and his brother Lev were incredible philanthropists. They underwrote essentially all of the Jewish institutions in the city, or at least many of them, including to a large measure the building of the Choral Synagogue, which you can see here and which still stands today. That was built in the very last years of the 19th century. But they were also, in a sense, city fathers insofar as they contributed huge sums to the building of all kinds of important institutions in the city at the time. Again, many of which still stand today. So you can see the largesse and the philanthropy of these men in stone and concrete. One of the important Jewish institutions that they built was called the Jewish Hospital, which you can see here. You can see one of the buildings. There was a complex of buildings that were built in the late 19th and early 20th century. It was one of the largest and best hospitals in the entire Russian Empire. And again, many of the buildings still stand. As far as cultural life, in the early years, it was quite difficult to engage in Jewish cultural life in Kiev because of the restrictions that I mentioned earlier. There were regular police raids on illegal Jews who were then unceremoniously arrested and kicked out of the city and told to go back to their towns or villages. But in the very last years of the 19th century and more particularly in the early 20th century, there emerged active Jewish political circles, Zionists and Bundists. And there was also a Yiddish literary circle that was called the Kiev Gruppe, the Kiev Group, that included some really important writers who then were also active in the early Soviet years. Obviously, as you all are well aware, there was also plenty of anti-Semitism that Jews had to confront both on the official level and among ordinary folk. And Kiev, like other places in the Ukrainian lands, other places in the Russian Empire, did experience some waves of pogroms in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, during World War I, Jews streamed into the city when the restrictions were lifted for all intents and purposes, and it was a very dangerous period for Jews. There were a tremendous number of massacres occurring throughout the Ukrainian countryside, and the cities were perceived by Jews as safer. So Jews come into the city in very large numbers, which leads to Kiev becoming one of the largest Jewish centers in the world. So in the 1920s, the Jewish population is about 130,000 out of 400,000 approximately. So a really, really enormous Jewish population. There was some very interesting cultural activity that took place during this period. And one particular group was called the Kulturliga, which was a Yiddishist cultural group that was very active in the city in the 1920s. There was also official state support of a certain kind of Yiddish culture, which was called proletarian Yiddish culture. And there were, in fact, academic institutes that were established that were, again, supported by the state. One of the most important ones was in Kiev, and this was the Institute of Jewish Proletarian Culture, which collected a very, very important library and archive that was unfortunately later on disbanded when the institute itself was liquidated in the 1930s. Now, of course, we're all aware of the massacre at Babyn Yar during World War II, which took place not only on the few days when tens of thousands of Jews were murdered there, but Babyn Yar continued to be a murder site throughout the entire war. But amazingly enough, because many Jews had been lucky enough to be evacuated before the Nazis arrived, the Jewish population returns to some hundreds of thousands in the post-war period. Obviously, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, it's very difficult to maintain any kind of active Jewish life, but there is often some kind of underground Jewish life, some Zionist activity, and often the cultural activity focuses on the memorial site of Babyn Yar itself. As you're probably aware, the Soviet memorial had no reference to Jews at all. I was lucky enough to be in Kiev. It's been a long time now since I was last there, mostly because of family responsibilities, but I maintain contacts there. It's a very vibrant Jewish community. There's all kinds of cultural and academic institutions that support Jewish life. the Institute Judaic, a Jewish Studies Research Center. There's an official Jewish Studies Center at one of the most important universities in Kiev, the National University of Kiev Mohila Academy, which is led by Leonid Finberg, who's a friend of mine. I'm proud to call him a friend. He's an important Jewish-Ukrainian dissident going way back and has become an intellectual leader during Ukrainian independence since 1991. Very much an advocate of the kind of Jewish-Ukrainian relations that Amelia was talking about before. There's a Jewish community center, an Israeli cultural center, the synagogues, including the Brodsky Synagogue, which is now operated by Chabad. And I thought I would also include here an image of old friends of mine from Kiev, the Markoviches, who are apparently now sheltering in Kiev and making their synagogue a shelter during the war for Kievans who need a place to find food and water and shelter. It's difficult to imagine what people are going through at the moment, and one can only hope that the city and the country will emerge. I can't say unscathed because that's no longer possible, but that most of the citizens and those who we hold dear will emerge with their lives intact in some way. Thank you for allowing me to speak today about Kiev, a city that's very dear to me, and I know we all hold it in our hearts today as the Russian military column advances.
Thank you so much, Natan, for walking us through Kiev and beautifully illuminating the distinctive and important role that Jews played in its history. And it certainly brought back memories for me of the city, and in particular one Shabbat that I spent there, where I was invited to spend it with both the Masorti and the Reform congregations. So I spent a very frantic 2 hours racing from the lovely, warm Masorti community to the beautiful Hatikva Reform Synagogue building, and really enjoying my time there. So yeah, like you and all of us, our hearts and thoughts are with all the people in Kiev and Ukraine. Well, now we're going to move south on our journey across the country and welcome Boris Dralyuk. So Boris emigrated from Odessa with his family when he was 8 and settled in Los Angeles, where he is now the editor-in-chief of the Los Angeles Review of Books. He's an internationally renowned translator of Russian and Ukrainian literature. His translations include Lives and Deaths, a collection of short stories by Leo Tolstoy, Isaac Babel's Red Cavalry and Odessa Stories, and Andrei Kirkov's Grey Bees. He's also an accomplished poet, and his collection, My Hollywood and Other Poems, is out in April. So welcome, Boris.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and thank you to all of the organizers and presenters. I've learned a great deal, and it's wonderful to see this aspect of Ukrainian culture highlighted here. It's not something that Ukrainians are hiding, but it's something that we are very happy to contribute, I think, to this growing awareness of where Ukraine is, what Ukraine is, and what its history can teach us. Thank you again. I'm here to talk about Odessa, and I'm not a very polished professor. I'm not going to share my screen if I can help it, but I would like to read to you a little piece from 1916. This is how I'd like to begin, by Isaac Babel. It's included in this little collection of Odessa stories with its wonderfully noirish cover. We're dealing with gangsters after all. And this is something that a 20-year-old boy from Odessa wrote about the city that he loved. Odessa is a nasty place. Everybody knows that. Instead of saying a big difference, Odessans say two big differences, and things like this away, that away. But it seems to me this significant and most charming of cities in the Russian Empire has a lot going for it. Just think of it. Here's a town where the living is light and easy. Half the population is Jewish, and Jews are people that have a few simple things down pat. They marry so as not to be alone in this world, love so that their kind lives forever, save money so that they can afford a home and an Astrakhan jacket for the wife, and are philoprogenitive because loving your kids is just the right thing to do. Governors and circulars give the poor Jews no end of trouble, but it's hard to make them change their ways, for these ways are age-old. You won't change the Jews, and there's a lot you can learn from them. To a large degree, it's through their efforts that the atmosphere in Odessa has grown so light and easy. Odessa has sweet and wearying evenings in the springtime, the spicy aroma of acacia trees, and a moon overflowing with even, irresistible light above a dark sea. In the evenings, Odessa's plump and ridiculous bourgeoisie lie on couches in front of their ridiculous Philistine dachas, wearing their white socks and digesting their hearty suppers under a dark and velvety sky. Meanwhile, behind the bushes, their powdered wives, grown fat with idleness and naively corseted, succumb to the passionate caresses of temperamental students of medicine and law. In Odessa, Luftmenschen skulk around coffee shops, looking to earn a ruble and feed their families, but there's no work to be had. And what kind of work could there be for a useless Luftmensch? Odessa has a port, and in the port there are steamers from Newcastle, Cardiff, Marseille, and Port Said. There are Negroes, Englishmen, Frenchmen, and Americans. Odessa has enjoyed its moment of flowering, and now it has entered a period of decline, of a poetic, somewhat careless, and completely helpless decline. It sounds like Odessa, the reader will finally say, is a city like any other, and you, sir, are simply biased in the extreme. All right, so I'm biased, perhaps even in the extreme, but parole d'honneur, there truly is something to this place. That's Babyn Yar Odessa in 1916. Already hitting on all of the themes that would come to shape the Odessa myth in the Russophone literature of the 20th century. He was going to be the major contributor to that theme. But really, if you look at Soviet writing of the 1920s, a good half the names are of Odessans. Some of the leading poets of the 1920s, including Edward Bagritsky, who was as famous as Mayakovsky in the early 1920s, that's an Odessan there, a good friend of Babyl's. If you look at the comic literature of the 1920s, the novels 12 Chairs and The Golden Calf, that's the work of two Odessans, Ilya Ilf and Evgeny Petrov, one Jewish, the other Greek. Petrov's brother, not quite Greek, Russian. Petrov's brother, also a famous author, Valentin Kataev, would go on to write wonderful memoirs of what Odessa was like for a child on the cusp of revolution. Really, Soviet literature was shaped by these largely Jewish voices from Odessa. So why Jewish, why Odessa? Let's go back to the beginning. We've heard about the history of Kiev, about the large population of Jews in Kiev and of Kiev as a Jewish metropolis. I think Odessa has Kiev beat for one good reason. It was founded much later than that city. The culture of Odessa is relatively new. The city is young. It was built on land conquered from Turkey in the 1790s, established in 1794 by Catherine the Great. And as its population grew, so too grew its Jewish population. It was firmly in the Pale of Settlement, and it was a great opportunity for Jews on the make to build their lives, to live in a place of relative comfort. And so you see from the end of the 19th century on, about a third of the population of Odessa is Jewish. And because they got there so early, they contributed to the very making of the city in a way that they couldn't in other major cities outside of Moscow and Petersburg. The major contribution that they made, in my view, is to shape the spirit of the place and the language of the place. Notice that Babyn begins this little sketch with two quirks of the Odessan language. Instead of saying one, a big difference, they say two big differences. Those are two big differences. And they say this away, that away. Now, the elements of that are very telling. The two big differences we can account for partly through Yiddish. The other part that I've translated as this away, that away, kind of slang for directions, that comes directly from Ukrainian. So now I'd like to quote a little piece of text from 1895, about 15 to 20 years, written 15 to 20 years before Babyn set about creating the Odessa myth. And this is by a Russian journalist named Vlas Tarashevich, who spent the 1890s in Odessa. The little piece is a kind of throwaway newspaper article, a little local color for readers both in Odessa and throughout the rest of the Russian Empire. And in it, he makes fun of the way that Odessans speak what they call Russian. He goes through one quirk after another, and then finishes with this little tale. Such is the Odessan tongue. It's like a sausage stuffed with the languages of the entire world, prepared a la Grec, but with Polish sauce. Yet Odessans still insist that they're speaking Russian. Now, to me, that's a very telling piece of text from 1895. It's telling for two reasons. One, it establishes the difference between metropolitan Russian, the Russian of the Russian Empire, proper, established, codified Russian, and whatever this language is that they're speaking in Odessa, which benefits from the influx of people into the port. The fact that it is truly an international city-state more than it is a part of the Russian Empire. But there are also two very telling omissions. One omission is Yiddish, kind of unmentionable in a text of this kind published in a major newspaper at the time. Although 33% of the population at the time he's writing this identify Yiddish as their primary language in Odessa. The other language that goes unmentioned is Ukrainian. And Ukrainian, although the percentage of the population that's self-identified as Ukrainian at the end of the 19th century in Odessa is fairly small, up to 6%. Really, there were many more Ukrainians living in and around Odessa, and the language was as much shaped by Ukrainian as it was by any other influence. And the reason that Ukrainian goes unmentioned is partly because Ukrainian itself is officially not a language. Publication in Ukrainian has been banned in the Russian Empire at that time for 20 years by the Ems Ukaz. And that would continue, that ban on publication in Ukrainian would continue into the 19-teens, all the way up to the Russian Revolution. Then there would be a brief period of efflorescence of Ukrainian culture, and that too would be shut down in the 1930s, violently repressed, along with Yiddish culture a bit later. So all of these omissions are as telling as what's on the page. And the long suppression of Ukrainian as a contributor to Odessan culture is something that we're reckoning with. Now, I can give you a lot of details of my experiences in Odessa. I can show you a lot of pictures of Odessa, but those are easy to find. What I'd like to talk about now, I find this is a very good opportunity, is the fact that Odessa is a largely Russian-speaking city, has been a Russian-speaking city. But the Russian, as I've been trying to say, that Odessans speak is not your usual Russian. In fact, it is the language of entertainment, or was during the Soviet period. Partly because of Babyn, partly because of what Babyn was able to bring into Russophone Russian literature through his Odessa stories, the language became a known commodity. And if you hear someone speaking that Odessan tongue, you know immediately what it is that you're hearing. So why do I bring that up now? Why is this important to me currently as an Odessan who's watching the city being sandbagged and otherwise protected from impending disaster? It's important to me because I feel that that is precisely what's under attack, is the uniqueness of the Odessan character and the uniqueness of the Odessan language. Now, Odessans for a long time did not see themselves as either Russian or Ukrainian. They looked this way and that. They really were patriots of their city. But over the past 30 years, what I have seen is gradually an embrace of a Ukraine that embraced Odessa, meaning there was no, I saw when I last visited in 2019, a real effort at bridge building between the Ukrainophone administration and the Russophone population. I saw signs, it was a joy to see signs both in Ukrainian and in Russian. I saw people code switching, and I still heard elements of Jewish speech, although the population of Odessa is only 1% of the population of Odessa is Jewish. The influence of Jewish culture is still thick in the air. It did my heart good to see all that, just as it breaks my heart to see what's happening now. Putin partly justifies this invasion of Ukraine, and it's partly motivated by his attempt to reunite what he thinks is a Russian world. And this notion of the Russian world, which includes southern Ukraine as well as eastern Ukraine, is painful for me to imagine. There's no place in the world where I feel less comfortable than Moscow, and there's no place in the world where I feel more comfortable than Odessa. Those two cities are worlds apart. The languages that they speak are worlds apart, and yet precisely because Putin forcibly wants to co-opt this Russian-speaking portion of Ukraine by force, the Russian speakers, Odessan speakers, are turning away from Russian as a reaction to this horrid vision of the Russian world. I'm speaking with a lot of passion because it's something that touches me deeply. I think that the realm of Russian, the varieties of Russian, are going to shrink as a result of this disastrous war. And I would hate to see the loss of this delicate stew, or this sausage, as Vlas Daleshevich called it, because of this foolish act on the part of a war criminal. I'd like to close by reading a couple of poems. One is a sentimental poem that brings up a few themes and images that occur throughout what I call Odessan texts, texts about Odessa, texts from Odessa, images of the sea, images of the beach, that for any Odessan are enough to bring a tear to their eye. This is a poem that I translated after my last trip to Odessa in 2019, I hope you'll bear with me as I read it. It's by a poet named Simeon Ollender, not a very well-known poet. Once on a train, without warning, I heard two strangers say the name of the town I was born in, one July on a warm, rainy day. And I felt these fleeting neighbors give off a southern breeze. I saw the sun of my youth smiling above the trees. I remembered it all, the blue sea, the distant silvery dock, my friend's fishing boat, which he sailed in the morning fog. The light of the lighthouse, the ships, how still their shadows lie, and you, awash in white foam, home of a childhood gone by. The last poem I'd like to read is by Boris Dralyuk, who is currently in Odessa with his wife. They are hunkered down. They've established a bomb shelter in one room of their house. And Dralyuk is a perfect example of what we see happening. Here is a poet who writes largely in Russian, who is now switching to Ukrainian because of what we're seeing. After 2014, he sat down with a dictionary and started learning the language. But this poem was written in Russian, and I think it's important because it looks forward to the end of all hostilities and the horrors that may await us yet. So the poem is called When Victory is Ours. When victory is ours, the post-war executions start. The hasty meetings, the tribunal's passing sentence. We need to thin the ranks of all these prisoners of war. Why should we feed the generals we've vanquished? They've got as much blood on their hands as all the rest. We have the orders that they gave their men. The urge to murder is a form of sexual lust. You just can't stop. You want to, but you can't. And so it's up the ladder, hands behind their backs, with pastors, priests if they should happen to be Catholics, bags on their heads, nooses around their necks. Die, scum. In 7 decades, you'll get YouTube clicks. 5 minutes and a man is a dead body. Another 5, the coffin is nailed shut. War criminals deserve no hint of pity. A strong rope is enough, or a sure shot. The executioner, his skill is our great hope. Prison's expensive, killing simply costs less. The only justice is the bullet and the rope. The post-war era knows no other justice. For me, what's been remarkable about watching this invasion that has no justification, is the humanity of the Ukrainians in response to what is happening to them. Not only are they protecting themselves, but they are behaving with such valor that I don't foresee this poem coming to pass. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Boris, for such sensitive translation, as well as such thoughtful and compassionate and moving comments. I really have been thinking a lot, and I've been talking with our next speaker a lot about that tension between voices from Ukraine and voices from Moscow. We had quite a serious ethical debate about whether we should be including Russian voices in this panel. And we decided yes, because the Russian Jewish voices have often been the dissident ones. I personally have a really hard time with the fact that at the moment there seems to be a cultural boycott and a shutting down of any Russian voice, because it's precisely those cultural voices that have been over time and are now the voices of resistance. I'm going to introduce in a moment one of those voices of the Russian Jewish resistance. But before I do so, I just want to answer a question that's come up in our Q&A. Eva pointed out that so far our authors' reference have mostly been male. Women do play a part in this area. And before I go on to the very, very fine woman writer and very fine woman translator I'm about to introduce to you, for those who are English readers, one of the books I would recommend is Elaine Feinstein's Russian Jerusalem. Elaine Feinstein is an English language poet, but has done versions of many women, female Russian poets, including the Jewish Marina Tsvetaeva, also a dissident, also a critical voice, and an incredibly lyrical one. So have a look for Elaine's Russian Jerusalem, and also maybe have a look at, I think it's quite interesting to look at Tsvetaeva in a variety of translations. So maybe look her up and see all the different ways that she is portrayed in English. But what I want to do is come on to the writer that we have decided it was important to include here. Many of you will know Maria Stepanova's In Memory of Memory. It was shortlisted just last year for the International Booker Prize in a translation by Sasha Dugdale, who is with us this evening. Maria is indeed a novelist, memoirist. That book is called a romance. It's a kind of multivalent genre book. But she's also two other things. She is the editor of Kultura.ru, which is kind of the Russian equivalent of the New York Review of Books. And she's also a poet. Her most recent collection, War of the Beasts and the Animals, responded to the invasion of the Crimean Peninsula. I think it's incredibly brave of Maria, of Masha, to give us permission to have her words here today. As you all know, speaking out at the moment is not easy. And Masha is not only a very well-known writer, Maria Stepanova is not only a well-known writer, but she's also an independent journalist. To share her work with us, we have her translator, Sasha. So Sasha Dugdale's a very, very fine poet in her own right. She's translated Maria Stepanova's work, and she will talk about that. But she's also translated many other writers, including playwrights. And I just want to give a mention of her work for the Royal Court Theatre under the late and lamented Elise Dodgson. They've together worked on several Russian and Ukrainian plays over many years. And in 2017, I was privileged to see Sasha's adaptation of Bad Roads by Natalia Vorozhbit. And that first brought the Donbass conflict to the London stage. So Sasha might want to talk about her own work as the former editor of Modern Poetry and Translation, producing a Ukraine edition, as well as being Maria Stepanova's voice for us tonight in English. So to take us to the Crimea, let's welcome Sasha Dugdale.
Thank you so much, Aviva, and thank you, Rebecca, for organising this evening. For everybody who works with Ukrainian and Russian writers, this last couple of weeks has been a sort of unending hell. And so it's really good tonight to join so many people and so many friendly and known faces to talk about all the really good things about the region, its literature, its culture, its friendship, and its communal spirit. And so I'm very grateful to you all for your descriptions of all those cities that I know so well, Kiev, Odessa, and Moscow as well. I'd like to read from Maria's long poem, War of the Beasts and the Animals. It's quite a difficult and complex poem, so I will say a very few words about it before I start. I did ask Maria, and I talked to her about whether I should read the poem, and we decided it was very important because it was a Russian voice, a Russian anti-war voice. And as you'll know, at this stage, being anti-war is actually prohibited in Russia, and making any kind of statement against the war can actually be punishable by a prison sentence. So there's it's quite a difficult regime to have any sort of meaningful protest in. Maria wrote this long poem a while ago in 2014. She wrote it during the first Donbass war, the first invasion of the Donbass region. And she wrote it because she'd been in Europe working, and she'd come back to Moscow, and it was a summer evening, a glorious summer evening. This is how she described it to me. There were people out in the streets, there were people in the street cafes, and she suddenly felt the sense of strangeness that a war was being carried out in her name in another part of and not very far away from Moscow. And yet in Moscow, everything was carrying on as normal. In fact, it wasn't just as normal, it was wonderful. It was a beautiful evening. And that sense of cognitive dissonance is what led her to write the poem. The poem is a sort of I described it as a sort of supercharged modernism, and it has a lot of references in it to European and Russian literature, and it uses those to create a sense of the way in which language and culture edge us towards violence and war. I should say, and this for me is very important, that I couldn't translate this poem for a while. I couldn't get hold of it. In fact, what happened was that the atmosphere changed in the UK in 2016. Many of the discussions around Brexit were based on arguments that were xenophobic, were nationalist, were oddly imperialist. And all of a sudden it became very clear to me how you could reform the poem, how you could translate it into English. So I just want to make this point that these are really, really terrible days, but there's much that's happening in that region, and there's a great deal of condemnation when in fact we're all of us in political situations that are very difficult, and I feel that very profoundly. I feel such terrible sympathy for my Ukrainian friends, the poets and the writers and playwrights that I translate in Ukraine, and I also feel huge sympathy for my Russian friends who are also going through unimaginable psychological suffering, if not actual bombing and all the terrible things we're seeing in Ukraine. So I'll just read now from War of the Beasts and the Animals. Look, the spirits have gathered at your bedside, speaking in Lethean tongues. Hushaby, so flesh and fine. For what do you long? I smiled. He said, Marusia, Marusia, hold on tight. And down we went. November, the cruelest month, the hoarsest month. Driving from the dead clay, peasants forged to the field, cows, curs leaving over their dead body, the post bag snagged in the stream, the tin spoon, the quick stream slipping, the quicksilver slip sliding away to the estuary. This little piggy went to market, and this little piggy froze to death, and the landowner put a gun to his head, and a black car came for the officer. The Greek in Odessa, the Jew in Warsaw, the callow young cavalryman, the Soviet schoolboy, Gastello the pilot, and all those who died in this land. Out of the murky pool, the surface still warmed by the sun, in a night in May, steps Rus al-Ka, and quickly begins her work, throws her wet clothes from her, tramples with her wet feet, her black body shines, her white smock cast. Mother, mother, is that you? Alyosha, I don't rightly know. Oh, swallow, swallow, is it her? She flew away, my friend. Sing to me of how, on an ancient alley on your family's estate, the weathered bones lay bleached and scattered under a birch tree. Quietly they chattered. There was no point to us. We didn't lend each other our hands. Like babes, we lay in the nursery in our swaddling bands. I can just imagine coming under him, says one, and I can hear everything. And the other is speaking. Fruits of the curbside, reads the jar label. From whatever takes root in the stony rubbish, embers, sawdust, scorched wood, suspended in sweet amber sugar, cockerel-shaped lollies for the Day of the Dead. When I'm off to market, or when I'm coming home, I often remember what she said back then. One leg crossed the other, who goes on top? One leg vows to the other, I'll top you. Children in the yard played at being Olympian gods, and then at Gestapo interrogation. To be honest, it's much the same. I had a dream, night in its nuptial attire, the cornfield, the melon's swelling body. Under the stars, the machine gunner sings to the machine gun, swaddled, cradled at his breast. Sleep, my sunflower, sleep, my poppy. Soon the warm sun will come back from the south, and there'll be new life in the pedestrian subway, playing on the half-dismembered harmony. And soldiers, soldiers, gather the light ash in pots. How little earth was saved on the bosom of the earth. Lift the corner of the blanket, replace the hot water bottle, measure perspiration, water, allow reach for it, deep in draft, ditch after dug out, dogged, indrafted. Say the word that don't belong, put it on and march along, forget the old and step anew, and the word will march with you. That word, it curls up and dies at your lips as it emerges. Like the spread-eagled toad, it lies in the heat on the verges. It clots, sticky in the mouth, froths, issues. Here, let me wipe it out. It's in the tissue. Ugh, ugh, and gagging. They don't mean anything. When they die, they're gone. Blue wings thrown wide under the weight of the sky. The eagle floats over the forest, undulating in the air like a place, divested of alphabet. On the 22nd of June at 4 o'clock on the dot, I won't be listening to anything. I'll have my eyes shut. I'll bury the foreign broadcast. It's the news, but I won't lift a hand. If anyone comes, I'm out of the loop. I'm a sparrow. I'm no man's land. That night, over the field of battle, the nachtigall tells the nachtigall, nightingale gasps in disbelief. And in neighbouring places, bird tells bird, passing from beak to beak like a dead frog, the exact silence. Earth's caesura between the stains of the sighted, between one mottled zone of streetlights, warmed by proximate life and its answering beam, the sightlessness of moss on boughs, anxious flight, armoured vehicles, lenses aimed at movement. No difference between first and second, patriotic or patriotic, great or Pacific, Atlantic, world. All the same, they fall to the only, the civil, where sunrise quivers in the cinders, draws out the spear tips. Mate, hey, mate, gis alike, says the dead to the dead, says the killed to the killer. And I'm just going to end with a little piece that she's written, which is in Russian, wonderful because it sort of dismembers the language completely. So I'll just read this bit to finish. We know German, we know German, on our offspring down grew, no man we know, not become. We know German, rage, blood, no fish we fish now, dumb, fish we can do deal with. No thing we, no skull we, no house bird, no cherry tree. We know, we, you, we know, we. In the myrtle grove I sleep and see. Beyond, behind, spoke in word, rush and bear, melodize. We know not straight away. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha, for reading so beautifully those very powerful words of Maria Stepanova. And like Aviva, and as you said, it's so important that we hear the words of Russians who are opposing the war, and we wish that Maria be safe and well at the moment. Thank you very much. It's beautiful. Now we're going to look at the work of World Jewish Relief and find out what we can do to help this situation, if there are things that can be done. And before I do that, I'd just like to introduce Alex Brookes from World Jewish Relief. When I was in Ukraine in 2015, I saw firsthand the inspiring work that World Jewish Relief was doing. And one lively initiative particularly struck in my mind. I attended a tea party held by a very elegant woman with white hair called Galina. And she was holding this tea party as part of an initiative called Warm Homes, whereby elderly people hosted get-togethers for other elderly people in their homes in order to combat loneliness. And this was just one of many, many initiatives that I saw. There were community centres, shelters for vulnerable people, and a huge amount of work that was being done there. So now World Jewish Relief are helping to evacuate people from the country and assist those living through this conflict. And in the coming weeks, the organisation will be focusing on accommodation, safe spaces for women and children, psychological support, and offering legal help for those fleeing the country. So we're delighted to have Alex Brookes join us tonight to talk about this work. Alex is the Director of Development for World Jewish Relief, and has over 20 years of experience in the voluntary, charity and public sectors for national and international organisations, including the UN and the British Council. So let's go now to Alex.
Thank you, Rebecca. And thanks to Jewish Renaissance for giving us the opportunity to be part of what's been a wonderful and interesting evening. I've learned so much, so thank you very much. And also particular thanks for helping us spread the message about our crisis appeal, which Ian mentioned right at the beginning, and I'll talk about a little more in detail. So for those of you who don't know us as well, World Jewish Relief was initially founded in the 1930s under the name the Central British Fund of First German Jewry and then World Jewish Relief, originally to help the Jews of Europe leave and find safe passage to the UK. And we've been supporting refugees ever since. And we're proud to work both within and beyond the Jewish communities. But I thought tonight I'll just spend a few minutes talking about our work in Ukraine, where we've been working for many, many years, as in other parts of Eastern Europe, including Moldova, Belarus, Georgia, and so on. And we do a number of different things, but our key work there has been supporting the older Jewish community who live with insufficient pensions and in often dilapidated housing. And so one of the things we've been really proud to be able to do is repair homes. So you see here, this is Galina in her kitchen that had holes in the roof. She didn't have running water at all times. And so we're proud to have been able to repair more than 3,500 homes across the region. You'll be thinking, as I am, about how many of those homes will need repair again. As Rebecca just mentioned, a number of cultural activities that we're able to support within the community centres there. I also, cooking lessons and arts and crafts. I also have a picture here of one of those warm homes, the tea parties that you mentioned. And other activities that we do, including supporting individuals with dementia and those that care for them, and helping to increase the knowledge and awareness of dementia across the region. We also help young people and the next generations to try and make sure that they're not in the same situation of poverty as some of their elder relatives. So we've helped thousands of people into work, and into new livelihoods or into more successful livelihoods. The last few years with the pandemic has obviously been particularly tough. About a third of our graduates were back needing to look for work again, as the sectors in which they worked, hospitality and so on, were severely affected by the pandemic. But some of our activity, you'll see here a picture of people celebrating Hanukkah together via the power of Zoom. Some of our activities we adapted as much as we could during the pandemic, and activity had started to go back to face-to-face when a number of weeks ago now, the terrible war began. Now, what's been fascinating in all ways for us is, as well as our work with older people, we also globally respond in times of international disaster and refugee crises. And this time, with the current situation, all the areas of our work have combined. So we're looking at an emergency situation with the older people that we support. And it's, for some of us, it's more personal. We've all been there. We've visited the wonderful cities and places. We've taken supporters there and groups of young professionals. There are partners there that we know well and participants that we know well, who we are thinking about constantly and being in touch with as many as we can. And we're responding to the crisis in a number of different ways. So for those that can, we're helping people leave. We've been involved in helping people get on buses and trains in order to leave. We've been providing cash transfers, food and medical equipment, and we're doing what we can for those that can't leave. I talked before about the older population that we generally support, many of whom are not in a position to leave the country. So we're working with our brave and incredible partners to provide support, food, medicine, psychological support. We're continuing home care as much as we can. So that's helping people who can't leave their house, that they need support with shopping or with bathing or generally to combat loneliness. So we're doing all we can with the partners that we're working with. We've also been working with the Ukrainian embassy to provide emergency food packages. And obviously, or maybe not obviously, but our work now isn't limited to the Jewish communities that we've previously supported. We're doing what we can, where we can, to help. Outside of Ukraine, there's also quite a lot of activity going on. So in Poland and Moldova, which are two of the countries where refugees are leaving, I read today that the UN think 2 million Ukrainians have fled the country. So we're helping our partners scale up their capacity to welcome refugees. And again, we're providing cash transfers, legal advice, and food and shelter, as Rebecca mentioned. We've sent specialists from our teams to both Poland and Moldova to support our partners there, to make sure that they're doing all they can to build their capacity to assist the refugees that are fleeing. And I've actually got some pictures on the next page. And in the UK, for those of you joining from here, we already have a large refugee employment program. We've been working with Syrians since 2015. We've been working with the Afghan cohort that started to arrive last summer. We have a very successful employment program, and we've told the Home Office that we're ready to accept Ukrainians as they arrive as well. And we're urging the Home Office to extend humanitarian visas to Ukrainians. These pictures, oh, sorry, that's very bad tech. You can see some of these pictures, they're actually from today, from our colleagues in Poland who are assisting, as I said, partners across the border. I wanted to show in this picture the huge amount of food, baby food we see here, nappies, formula, and so on, most of which has been donated by Polish communities. And it's one of the reasons we're saying no for those people, those very, very generous people that are asking us to collect food, nappies, clothes, and so on. There's been such an outpouring of generosity, and a lot of people want to give food and materials like this, and we're just not able to process everything. There's limited transport routes, so we want to save the ones there are for the medicines and things that are going to be really essential. And also local communities are providing currently, so that's another reason why we're doing our best to resist those very generous offers that we're receiving for food and clothes and blankets. Why are we able to do this? Why have we been able to respond so well to the Ukraine crisis appeal? And it's because of our partner network. So I said before, we've been working in Ukraine for many, many years. We now have 29 really solid, really professional, really incredible partners across the country. And where they can, and as much as they can, they're still going. They're sourcing medicine. They're working with other organizations to share the materials that they have. And there's been some stories that are heartbreaking and heartwarming to hear. We're also able to do it because of the huge outpouring from Jewish community in the UK and elsewhere. People want to help. We're able to be that vehicle for those that wish to respond. If you'll allow me just one last minute, I wanted to share something that a colleague of mine wrote. And he wrote it so well, I decided to use his words rather than try my own. He said, over the last few weeks, I felt a range of emotions. I felt sad, I felt angry, I felt disbelief, but I've also felt proud of our partners on the ground in Ukraine, staying, doing what they can for those that need it. Proud of the generosity of supporters, but I've also not felt helpless. And I've not felt helpless because we can do something about this. We can help those who need us the most, both within the Jewish community and beyond. And for those of you joining that are able to, it's something that you also can do this evening, with thanks to the Jewish Renaissance for inviting us and for supporting our appeal. I've put the details here. I've also put my email address. So I invite people, I can't see my email address because of the format of Zoom, but I'm hoping that other people can see it. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions, if you'd like to know more about anything I've spoken about. And I thank you all. And once again, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here tonight.
Thank you so much, Alex. And I have to say, I can attest to the fact that Alex will respond to her email whenever, whatever. While Jewish Relief is doing massive work on a grand scale, they're also doing individual work. And I know I had a message about some people who needed help at the weekend. I emailed her. It was the middle of Sunday afternoon. She didn't need to be working. Within 5 minutes, she sent me such useful information. So we're really grateful to you, Alex, for everything you're doing on the micro scale, the macro scale. And we are so honoured to be our Jewish Relief partners. We have one more speaker before we finish, but she's actually going to introduce the music that will play us out. So before I bring her in, I'm going to do my thank yous now. I'm going to thank World Jewish Relief, who've been our partners, and we will be sending you all their details. So those who haven't donated, you still have the opportunity and you'll receive their details tomorrow. I also want to thank our other partners, the Jewish Book Council in America. Yes, Jewish Renaissance is a British organisation, but the transatlantic nature of this evening was because the Jewish Book Council partnered with us, and we're really, really grateful to them, and we hope to continue working together. So particularly Naomi and Simona there. I'd also like to thank my team, Rebecca, who you've seen, Danielle, Emma, Lorraine and Ruth, who've all been working round the clock. The last group I want to thank, though, are our speakers. You can all see how wonderful they are. And this isn't the only session like this they've been doing. They've all been more in demand than ever before. They've been working round the clock, doing this kind of education. They've been also working with Ukrainian and Russian writers and refugees. And we are really grateful to them for giving up their time and their expertise. So to Amelia, to Boris, to Sasha, to Natan, and to Josephine, who is about to speak, thank you so much. So let me bring Josephine in. When Rebecca and I decided we want to do this, we'd been thinking of it, but we were particularly spurred into it by the speech Zelensky made after the bombing of Babyn Yar. It's been mentioned a little bit this evening, but I think for all Jews around the world, the notion of Babyn Yar, that ravine where so much terror happened, being the site of yet more death, was something I think every one of us just felt was unbelievable and shocking. Josephine Burton, who is our last speaker this evening, is the artistic director and co-founder of Dash Arts. So Dash Arts is an incredible international organisation that creates artistic experiences to bridge divides across art forms, cultures, languages and communities. And in 2021, Josephine was the director of a Dash Arts production called Songs for Babyn Yar. We're going to end this evening by playing you a little bit of that music. But firstly, to tell us a little bit about the history of her project and her own connection to Babyn Yar, I'm going to hand over to Josephine and wish Josephine, but to wish you all, our audience and supporters, a huge thank you. Josephine, over to you.
Thank you, Aviva, and thank you all so much for this amazing evening. It's just been a privilege to be part of the evening, and to learn so much myself, and to sort of kind of echo Alex's colleague. I have felt very helpless over the last few weeks, watching so many of my friends struggling and dealing with so much in Ukraine, and feeling unable really to help them. So it's a privilege really for me to be with you this evening, and to be doing my bit to try to help, and to help garner support for many who need it. As Aviva so eloquently said, I am a theatre director and a creator, and in 2019 I was approached by a Ukrainian friend of mine who said, can I possibly help create some project with a wonderful musician who I already worked with, Maria Stepanova, who is Ukrainian by birth, Ukrainian Christian, lives and now currently lives in Germany. And could I work with her and another extraordinary artist also born in Ukraine, Svetlana Kundich, who is a Ukrainian Jewish and currently also living in Germany. And I'd never met Svetlana before, but I was totally thrilled to be introduced to her. And the two of us started to talk about what possibly we could work on together, that might explore their shared background as sort of as Ukrainians outside in the diaspora, both living in Germany. And we started to talk and plot and think and explore so many of the connections, and we really wanted to explore the connection between the kind of ethnic Ukrainian and the kind of the Jewish communities of Ukraine. And I'm just thinking about the conversation that Amelia started it off with, thinking about how citizenship today, it's about Ukrainian citizenship, and those conversations really were woven into all of the conversations that we had in the early days about what it is to be Ukrainian and have this legacy of being Jewish and have this legacy of being an ethnic Ukrainian Orthodox. So we were plotting and planning, and then the pandemic kicked in, which delayed everything. And suddenly on the horizon loomed the anniversary of the 80th anniversary of the massacre at Babyn Yar, which was in the end of September, as many of us will know, on kind of Erev Yom Kippur in September 1941. And we suddenly realized that by the time, kind of because we've been delayed some time by the pandemic, there was this deadline, there was this date on the horizon. And we decided that there was really no other event, no other kind of moment in Ukrainian culture that we could look at that it had to be about exploring the legacy of Babyn Yar today on Ukrainian-Jewish relations. I brought in another friend of mine as well, Yuri Gergi, also an extraordinary artist who is both he's Ukrainian Jewish and he's kind of sits with lots of different cultures in his background. And the four of us, myself included, started to plot and started to explore how on earth we could tackle this extraordinary, terrible tragedy in a way that would be sensitive and true and explore not just what had happened in 1941 and its the legacy, but the legacy of it and its impact today. And all three artists wanted to draw on their own personal family experiences and bring and source a lot of extraordinary material. Amelia mentioned Mariana Kianovska's poetry, which is unbelievable poetry from the voices from Babyn Yar. We brought her poems into the rehearsal room. We brought an extraordinary another book called Babyn Yar, a document in the form of a novel, which is an episodic story written by a survivor of the war who lived through the war in Podil, which I'm referencing everyone. Natan mentioned Podil, the neighborhood. A young man, Anatoly Kuznetsov, wrote about his experiences of living through the war in Kiev between 1941 and 1943 as a 13-year-old, 14-year-old child. And the book is amazing. It was published shortly after the war in heavily censored form, and subsequently he sort of finally left the Soviet Union, smuggled the manuscript out with him, and it was finally published in the UK in different fonts. So you saw the censored bits, and then the bits that were the kind of uncensored bits in different fonts, and you could sort of extraordinarily kind of, it's an amazing document about what it was to live through the Second World War, but also through Soviet times and the oppression of literature. So we took some of his book into the rehearsal room, and then most importantly, we took an unbelievable woman called Rahil Blankman, who is herself a survivor of Babyn Yar, one of the many that Natan mentioned who left Kiev just before the war, but she was on one of the very last trains out of Kiev to Krasnoyarsk in Siberia, leaving behind her family, and she returned in 1945 to discover that her whole family, her mother, her father, her brother, she herself had left at 13, her whole family had died at Babyn Yar. And she's now 93, possibly turning 94, living in Germany, and we involved her testimony and her stories and her interviews with her into our show, and together we wrote music that drew on these texts, drew on the stories, and threaded together a narrative that took us into the Yar and tried to find some redemptive possibility of life beyond living through the experience of Babyn Yar. It was an unbelievable journey to work on with these musicians. We made it in Germany. We performed it at JW3 in London, and we traveled in December to play it in Kiev. It's performed in Ukrainian, in Russian, in Yiddish, in Hebrew, and in English, and in Roma, because we have one Roma song in there as well. And in England, we had all the performers involved their own expressions and experiences of what it is to deal with and encounter this material. They spoke in English, and in Ukraine we translated it all into Ukrainian. And behind the performers, we had some phenomenal captioning and surtitling of the translations of the script and also of the songs. And I have to say, it was unbelievably extraordinary to perform this show in Kiev. We went to Babyn Yar the morning of the show, myself with the 3 musicians, and we spent time in that site, which is now ravaged, destroyed. And then we went to the theatre on the neighbourhood, which Natan mentioned, which had been so Jewish before the war. And we presented the piece in Ukrainian and in Russian with Ukrainian subtitles in the theatre, and a packed house of extraordinary invited guests. We were brought by the Ukrainian Institute. And the night was phenomenal. The show went down unbelievably well. It was incredibly emotional. It is an emotional show. The artists were in tears. And we had a Q&A session after the performance with everybody stayed, and everybody wanted to speak and share and talk about what it is to not have been able to speak about Babyn Yar and the terrible massacre of Jews in 1941, how for so many years they couldn't talk about it. And it was a group therapy session for the audience, there was incredible kind of optimism there. It sounds absurd to talk about optimism, but this real feeling that they'd moved on from that time, and this was the new Ukraine. Natan, I think Amelia was talking about it earlier. There was just a feeling of something had moved, some sort of future that the whole audience was looking towards, where they could talk about what happened under Soviet times and what happened, and we talked about anti-Semitism. It was called as part of the show, and it was acknowledged in the audience. And there were floods of tears and laughter and poetry. And now, of course, it's only 3 months ago, and the city, the theatre, which was kind of packed to the rafters. I'm not sure what's happened to that theatre. Certainly, we all know what happened to the site of Babyn Yar that I was only in 3 months ago. And my extraordinary collaborators, who were all in Germany, have been lobbying and pushing and advocating to support to kind of play music. They've been playing music. They've been on newspapers. They've been trying to draw awareness to what's going on at the same time as trying to look after their families and get them out of Ukraine. So I feel very emotional talking about it. It's an extraordinarily emotional experience to have been so close and touch this world so kind of open-heartedly, and feel so helpless really now for the communities over there. The show is completely beautiful and so relevant, and obviously so resonant now. We're very keen to find ways to share that work, and to continue to kind of talk about and to bring it out into the world beyond during this time, but to do it in a way that's kind of done to support the communities. So we are definitely looking to take the show to Germany later this year. That's definitely already part of the plan, and I really hope to the States, and one day we hope back to Ukraine. I think you're going to see a little bit of the opening of the show now. From when we did it, I hope I'm right in thinking that's what you've been given, and that I believe it's the beginning from the show that we opened in the JW3 in the autumn, and I really hope that you it gives you a flavour of the work. And when we do bring it back, when we're able to share that work again, please come and see it. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about performance, and a huge thanks to everybody, and particularly to great kind of power to World Jewish Relief Elbow for their amazing work. Thank you.
Hi.